To do a quick video on babysitting by Gillian Clark. It's called Babysitting. We should not assume that this is necessarily written from the point of view of a standard babysitter. It might well be. We could take a literal reading of the poem, or we could see babysitting as potentially metaphorical, as the perceived relationship between a baby and a mother who haven't bonded, from the perspective of a mother who hasn't yet accepted the baby as her own and feels that she's looking after somebody else's baby. Childbirth is complicated and emotionally complicated, particularly in the early stages. So at the outset of this poem, I think it's important just to be open-minded about the implications of this title, which Gillian Clark gifts us at the beginning. So it's intended there as it's a guide, but let's try and avoid jumping to assumptions about it. The poem takes the form of a monologue. You've got one voice talking, and it's a distinctive voice. We know that from the very first word of the poem, I. It's told from a specific point of view. There's a distinctive character behind the poem, behind the voice of the poem. That isn't always the case, but it is the case here. It's a monologue, and with that comes a certain theatrical quality to it. A monologue is usually something that's delivered on stage, so this poem is in some ways something that you might have delivered on stage. It's written in situ. I've written here, that's Latin. It means as if the action of the poem is taking place in the background. And you can see that again from the first line. I am sitting in the wrong room. So we've got this kind of action going on at the same time as the text, as the text flowing. So it's a monologue written in situ, as if the things are really happening whilst we're reading the poem. I've written, is this the voice of the present, or is it a memory? I am sitting makes it ambiguous. And I just write that because sometimes that's the way people tell stories. So, right, I'm sitting in the room. You see what I mean? So sometimes people choose to use that continuous present, that's called the continuous present. I am sitting, I am talking, I am having lunch right now. That's the continuous present. And so just by using that, she leaves open the possibility that this is some sort of memory or vision or story that she's telling retrospectively, even though it's written in the present tense. So that's an alternative reading to saying that it's in situ and the action is really taking place whilst this voice is talking. Perhaps this is the voice in the head of the babysitter whilst the action is taking place. I've given some possible descriptions of the overall tone and feel of the poem up here. Resentful, cold, empty, conflicted, because there are some hints of empathy and feeling in this poem. How could there fail to be? She's looking after an innocent little baby, so there's conflict there as well. Doubtful, distracted as in would like to focus on something else, but can't take her attention from the baby in this awkward position that she feels that she's in. If it is a she, but I think I'm going to work on the assumption that the voice of this poem is that of a woman. And then passive, as in lacking in energy, lacking in agency and forthrightness, lacking in activity, passive, just sitting there So it begins with what I've called some straightforward sentences. You've always got to be careful about saying that things are straightforward in English, because there's always a risk that you're just highlighting that you haven't managed to appreciate their complexity. But in this case, that's what I've gone for there. So we've got straightforward sentences. I am sitting in the wrong room, listening for the wrong baby. I don't love this baby. She is sleeping a snuffly roseate, bubbling sleep. She is fair. She is a perfectly acceptable child. Now, obviously, you don't want to read the poem like that, but what I'm trying to stress by reading it in that way is the similarity in the speech patterns that Gillian Clark's using. I am. I don't. She is. She is. She is. So that repetition, creating from the beginning this empty, cold feel to the poem. It's repetitive. It's a bit dull. It's deliberately dull, that speech pattern. It's the speech pattern of someone who isn't feeling fluent and interconnected feelings. It seems stunted and fragmented and disjointed and lacking in feeling. Possibly like a mother who is feeling very emotionally conflicted and doesn't know what to think, doesn't know what to feel, and is possibly in a state of shock. If we're taking the mother reading, it could just be a babysitter. And that's fine. It's ambiguous, and we should accept the ambiguity. If you're being asked to write about this in an essay or in an exam, then acknowledge the ambiguity and use it as an opportunity to get double the points, because you can outline more than one possibility. Now, moving on, she's sleeping a snuffly, roseate, bubbling sleep. So it's the first time in the poem that some interesting and creative language has crept in here. Snuffly, onomatopoeia. Roseate, meaning, well, pertaining to the rosy colour. And bubbly sleep. Sleep doesn't have a colour, sleep doesn't bubble. I guess sleep can be snuffly if you're snuffling while you sleep, but these are metaphors or imagery. In fact, I've called them abstract imagery here. The image of sleep being bubbling and roseate. And we've got that onomatopoeia here. Now, why? Why is that important? We have to explain these things. There's no point just spotting them. I've written, how is the narrator's mind working? And really that's the question to ask, or that's the effect of these more interesting word choices. Suddenly we can see the narrator's or the voice's mind at work. Is there a hint of suppressed tenderness here for her to have come up with this more creative language that requires engagement and empathy and creativity to come up with those unusual words of describing sleep? So at this point there's just a hint of connection, and that's juxtaposed with these statements of indifference. I don't love this baby. So the juxtaposition of this creative language hinting at engagement is juxtaposed with the statement of detachment. I've written here, of course, there's no name. The baby's never given a name. It remains anonymous. It's always just this baby. Although later it becomes she. She is a perfectly acceptable child. This line distances her from the child again, following this slight closing of the distance here. She is a perfectly acceptable child. I've written cold, formal diction, perfectly acceptable. That's not the way not language that we'd normally use to describe a child. Certainly not if you were in the capacity of a carer or someone given the duty of looking after. So So I've written cold formal diction. Perfectly is a hyperbole, of course, but it's a hyperbole that in this case means enough. She's acceptable enough. It's a kind of phrase that we use when we're qualifying ourselves. She seems to be qualifying herself, as if to say, there's nothing wrong with her, I just don't love her, I just don't like her. She's a perfectly acceptable child, I just don't love this baby. And of course that's rather a surprising qualification to make because of its coldness and its objectivity. I am afraid of her. Short sentence, again, disjointed, fragmented texture to this poem, suggestive of someone lacking fluency, not understanding, struggling. I guess that's a good word. She's struggling here. All these short sentences, and I think if you're writing an essay, it's good to spell out, what do you mean by short sentence? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can mention these short 5-word sentences suggesting disjointed sentences to suggest struggling with feelings. If she wakes, she will hate me. She will shout her hot midnight rage. Her nose will stream disgustingly, and the perfume of her breath will fail to enchant me. She gathers fluency here, though, following this disjuncture. She does gather some fluency and moves into the future tense, interestingly, for the first time. The future tense has all been in the present tense so far. Now it's in the future tense. So there's a suggestion of more development, more momentum here. Is she in some way enjoying, in a self-loathing way perhaps, this image that she creates here, this scenario in the future when the baby wakes up and is cross? She will shout her hot midnight rage. The baby wakes up unhappy, hungry, uncomfortable, and then she starts imagining the symptoms of that. Her nose will stream disgustingly, that's clear enough, and the perfume of her breath will fail to enchant me. So these more attractive words here pertaining to delight and enjoyment are possibly a little bit sarcastic and resentful. People tend to like the smell of babies. They don't even the breath of a baby is not repellent in the way that the breath of an adult might be. So it's almost as if she's quoting other people here by recycling their language. This is the language of people who like babies, who are comfortable with their babies. So there's possibly a bit of sarcasm there. So this is a bit more developed, this second bit of the first stanza I've written. More developed, she uses a compound sentence. That means that it's the bit with and. So her nose will stream disgustingly, and the perfume of her breath will fail to enchant me. She hasn't done that yet. She hasn't used a compound sentence. So there's a bit more fluency here. Again, rather than what does this tell us about the baby, what does it tell us about the voice, the narrator? And here, her imagination seems to be working harder now, and more fluently as well. Is there a sort of enjoyment conjuring this scene? I don't really mean a pleasant enjoyment, but is she enjoying imagining how miserable she's going to be when this happens, in a sort of self-vindication of her feelings? Is she at least taking some comfort from persuading herself that she's right? Yeah, this is what it's going to be like, and just revelling in her own unhappiness in that burst of fluency there. Something to think about. So we'll move on to the second stanza now. So, let's just recap over the first stanza. It's this monologue. she states her position at the beginning. I don't love this baby. She qualifies it a bit, and then the second half is her imagining what's going to happen when the baby wakes up, and the whole thing is charged, as I've said, with this sense of resentment and indifference, but possibly a conflicted indifference, but with hints of engagement and empathy. And this is developed more in the second stanza, where we see more empathy and engagement. And I've pointed out at the beginning here that Clarke front loads the adverbials in these two sentences. Now, an adverbial is a word or a phrase which qualifies the action that follows. That's not a perfect definition of it, but it's the best I can do off the cuff right now. Hopefully you can see what I mean. To her, not a main part of the sentence. For her, not a main part of the sentence. The sentence would make sense without either of these phrases. I will represent absolute abandonment. It will be worse than for the lover. So if we got rid of these, it would read more like in the first stanza. But these just change they change the balance of the first sentence, so that you can call this front loading the adverbials. You can call it that. That's a thing. Or she places the adverbials at the front of the sentence. It changes the balance of the sentence. It just changes the feel of the sentence, so we kind of note the change. But also it's more empathetic because both of them show us that she's now imagining things from the baby's point of view. Now that's quite a shift. Whereas this more developed image of the baby here, shouting her midnight rage, no streaming, that's very much from the voice's point of view, from the babysitter's point of view. But here the point of view is from the baby. And so there's more empathy, there's more engagement, even though we're aware that this voice is really struggling with this relationship, is not happy. There is more empathy and engagement. I will represent absolute abandonment. And that engagement is heightened by the hyperbole there, absolute abandonment. You might even go so far as to point out the assonance in absolute abandonment. Those open vowels there, the a sound, the repeated a, absolute abandonment, are they're evocative of strong emotions, of feelings of loss, which is what she thinks the baby's going to experience when it wakes up. So moving on, for her it will be worse than the lover cold in lonely sheets, worse than for the woman who waits a moment to collect her dignity beside the bleached bone in the maternity ward. Sorry, in the terminal ward. Gosh, why did I say maternity? In the terminal ward. So she offers two similes here. The two similes are the lover and the woman in the terminal ward. Now, maybe it's just me, but these strike me as quite strange similes to use in comparison with what the baby's likely to feel when it wakes up, when she wakes up and finds that she's all alone. They're strange similes because a baby is not. I don't know. I just think these experiences are going to be very different, because these experiences for an adult, they're mixed in with much stronger cognitive understanding of what's going on, and the baby doesn't have that. Now, that's not a criticism of the poem. It's and in fact it offers us a suggestion or a clue about the voice. This poem is all about the voice behind the poem. So I've said the similes offer surprising adult comparisons, suggesting adult preoccupations that might explain the tone of the poem. So they might help to suggest that this is not the baby's fault. This is the fault of other complicated adult issues. This is pure speculation on my part, but I think it's worth recognising that they're slightly strange similes, surprising similes to find, and so it's worth recognising that, and trying to explain what it might suggest about what kind of person makes these surprising connections. So maybe it's someone with adult issues on their mind. This line is a bit ambiguous, and it confuses a lot of people. Beside the bleached bone in the terminal ward, there I go again saying maternity ward. No, I say that. Beside the bleached bone in the terminal ward. Well, it's a bleached bone could just be a colour, but then being beside a colour would be a bit odd. Obviously, in a ward, you're going to have white sheets. If you've ever been in a hospital, you know there tends to be quite a lot of white or quite a lot of pale colours. So it could refer to a colour, but then it's beside the bleached bone. Have a think about that. It's ambiguous, but the simile as a whole is suggestive of, particularly with bleached. The simile as a whole, this woman waiting to collect her dignity, is suggestive of, well, someone who is in a rather tough and depressing position in a hospital. Is it the voice of the narrator herself? Is she the one in the terminal ward? Is she the one with the memory of collecting her dignity? Is she the mother? Has something gone wrong? Is she going to die because she's in the terminal ward? It's ambiguous, and I've written: is it being deliberately cryptic? Is it deliberately ambiguous because there are difficult truths that this poem is trying to address indirectly? Right? We don't need to nail down what the truths are. You just need to be able to suggest. Right, this is ambiguous. There are various possibilities for that ambiguity, but is it being ambiguous because there are difficult adult issues, as suggested by these similes here that she's dealing with? So moving into the final four lines. As she rises, sobbing from the monstrous land, stretching for milk familiar comforting, she will find me, and between us two it will not come. There's an agency that Clark gives the baby here. The baby rises, or she's being imagined rising, stretching. She will find me. These are not things that babies can do. Babies can stretch, I guess, and once they're a little bit older they can stretch. They can't really rise, and unless they're a bit more advanced in their lives, they can't find things. So she's giving the baby an interesting amount of agency here by using these verbs, and that contrasts with her general passivity that seems to run through the poem. I will represent. Right, that's not a thing you actively do. It's something that I will represent to her, to the baby. Absolute abandonment. I am afraid of her. I am sitting, right? Passive. Sitting. I'm afraid of her. She doesn't do anything. So here the baby seems active. She's given this agency, and the narrator seems passive. And again, that supports this kind of feeling of helplessness and doubt and powerlessness, emptiness that runs through the poem. Sobbing from the monstrous lands. There's more a metaphorical, creative language here, again suggesting an author's mind at work. baby empathising. I've written here, the imagery is evocative of imagination and empathy. There you go, you can borrow that phrase if you like. Stretching for milk, familiar, comforting. Again, milk, familiar, that's a playful, creative hyphenation there. What does it mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything established. So this baby is stretching for something that is as familiar as milk, or familiar because it smells like milk. It's not entirely clear, and it doesn't really matter. It means that the baby, or it reminds us that the baby is interested in milk and seeks the familiar, and sometimes those things are really the same thing. Very little babies, they don't know much apart from the warmth and skin touch of their mother and the feeding experience, milk. So this playful hyphenation here, again, it suggests engagement, it suggests creativity from this voice that is constantly resisting engagement or stating that it's not interested in engaging with the baby. She will find me, and between us two it will not come, it will not come. It's ambiguous here again, it's ambiguous, it's not entirely clear. Again, I've written, it's ambiguous, as if uncomfortable about spelling things out, or whatever the problem is. The voice doesn't really want to spell it out. Now, it will not come. What will not come? Is it reconciliation that won't come? This is the wrong baby, supposedly. We're going to take that literally or metaphorically. It's given to us as the wrong baby. So, is the wrong going to be made right? Is there going to be a reconciliation? Is that the thing that won't come? It's a possibility. Is it love that won't come? I don't love this baby. Is it love that won't come? Now, if this is just the voice of a babysitter, then we wouldn't expect love to come. But if the babysitting is a metaphor for a mother, then well, we would hope that love would come, and maybe that's what she's hoping. But if that's our interpretation, she just won't believe it at the moment. Look at that future tense there and the repeated phrase, 5-word phrase. It suggests emphasising a lack of belief, almost a determination. Or is it the milk that won't come? Is there, I don't know, is this partly about breastfeeding, difficulty in breastfeeding? It could even be that. It's not entirely clear. Those are all possibilities. And again, recognise the ambiguity, accept the ambiguity, sketch out the possibilities, and where possible, talk about how the patterns in the poem give these possibilities meaning. So if it's a problem with breastfeeding, or if it's an emotional problem in accepting the baby, this repetition here of these short sentences, 5-word sentences, it sounds like a determination, like she doesn't want it to come. Perhaps because she's just so confused and depressed. I don't know. There are various possibilities. Is it determined? Is it hopeless? Is it despairing? I've said the repetition sounds chant-like and absent here. It will not come. It will not come. Is it absent, bleak, hopeless, or just distracted? All sorts of possibilities there. So there's a lot to say about this poem. It isn't dripping in the kinds of set piece bits of imagery and metaphor and hyperbole and similes that you might have learnt to deal with. It doesn't have much of that. You've got to embrace the ambiguity and focus on the voice. Who is this woman, and how is she? If it is a woman, I think it is. Who is it, and how is she feeling about this whole situation? Whatever that what might the situation be, and how's the voice feeling about it, and how can you tell that from the way that the language, particularly, and the structure is used. I haven't spoken much about structure. I've spoken a bit about the structuring of sentences and lines, and that's about as much as I can say at the moment, so I hope that's helpful, and I'll sign off.